I'm John from Game Life Balance US, a proud member of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the one you're listening to now. The opinions expressed are those of each individual. Check out all the other geeky podcasts at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. And get ready, because geekiness commences in 3, 2, 1.
Greetings, and welcome to episode 142 of Better Podcasting. On this show, we're going to share our first-hand experience podcasting from a hotel room.
In this week's Better Podcasting Download, we discuss whether or not Google actually has a podcasting strategy.
In this week's Better Podback, we're asked about whether you need a host to podcast.
Finally, we'll give you our thoughts on Logitech acquiring Blue microphones, and we'll give you the history of last week's pro wrestling themed intro. Lauren, start the show now.
Welcome to Better Podcasting, a show where we talk about podcast tips, tools, and best practices to help you succeed with your podcast. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we podcast purely out of the love and fun of it. Podcasting is our hobby, and we recognize that it's yours too. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. Here's your hosts for the show, Stephen John Drew and Stargate Pioneer.
Welcome to episode 142 of Better Podcasting. I am Stephen John Drew, and with me, of course, is the wonderful Stargate Pioneer.
Greetings, everyone. This is a great week to have a podcast about podcasting because we have so much to cover. It's going to be a great show. And we're going to start off with a wonderful How I Could Have Saved My Podcast story. We have this little segment at the beginning of all of our shows. It's an either a How I Saved My Podcast story, and that we get from you, or sometimes Stephen or I will say our personal stories, or we grab one from the interwebs and we go through How I Could Have Saved My Podcast story. And today we're going to go through another great Reddit post, and this is a very thoughtful Reddit post. And we're going to go through it, and then we're going to give our reactions. So the title of this, it was posted on Reddit about a month ago, and it was from a burner Reddit account called Pod Needs Help. It wasn't the real account. It was a burner account. And the title was Moving On from Co-Host. The Reddit post proceeds, quote, I need some suggestions on how to handle moving on from my current co-host. I want to take the show in a different direction, and I would like to do it on my own. I don't think I can get to the places I want to be with my current co-host. Since starting the podcast, I have learned a lot and want to build on that knowledge and do things differently moving forward. I'm not sure he can help me move forward in the ways I want/need to in order to be fulfilled and feel like I'm doing the best show I can. The show was my idea to start. I came up with the name and have put in all of the money so far. It hasn't been a lot, but he has offered to help some, but I have never taken it. I also do all the editing and marketing for the pod. I know this is grounds enough to claim it as mine and do what I want, but I don't really want to use this unless it's a last resort type thing. We have been friends for like 6 years, and I don't want to ruin our friendship over this. He can be a bit touchy and bitter about things that don't go his way, so I'm trying to avoid this. I have had a good time so far with what we've done in only a few months, but I'm not fulfilled with the types of conversations we're having. I want our conversations to go deeper on the subjects we cover, but I don't think he has that in him. I have a good plan on what I want to do with the show once I move on, and I don't think I can get there with him. I don't want to leave it on bad terms because he will be important moving forward as well, and I would like to maintain our friendship. In the new format, I would like to feature guests, and he will be my go-to guy for some topics and a type of show within the show because there are some conversations I know he will be at the best at providing content in line with what I want. Please don't suggest that I do a second show on my own and continue to do the one with him. I personally don't have the time or the bandwidth to do 2 shows, and I have become quite partial to our name and the brand we've built so far. I'm not very good with confrontation or tact, So I'm asking for some help on how to broach the subject and have a productive and diplomatic conversation with him about this. I'm not listing the name of the show here, and I'm posting from a burner account. Sorry, I probably won't be responding to any comments, so he won't see it before I'm ready. And also, if anyone wants to listen to the show, you don't go into it with preconceived notions about me or him. Too long, didn't read. I'm not feeling fulfilled with the current structure of our show and need help confronting my current co-host diplomatically, so I can move on and do the show on my own the way I want to, unquote. Stephen, there's a lot of information on this. Where do you want to start?
First off, I'll just go ahead and say that's my account. So just right there, it's all about better podcasting. No, I'm just joking. So I have to say that it's interesting to me the way that this Reddit poster says, I want to go ahead and break the ties, but I expect to be good enough to be able to ask him on my new show. I would get rid of that notion right away. I think that notion alone is going to go ahead and ruin your decision tree as far as what's the best way going to be to handle this, because I think you have to be realistic, and they might get a little burned if they find out that these are the reasons behind it. For this sort of perspective, I think the easiest thing, because it is a friend, is to find an easier out. I know that sometimes we would like to be direct with things, but sometimes for the sake of friendship, it's easier just to go ahead and say, look, I have this other project that I really would like to do. As they mentioned the post, I don't have the time to do both. And I'm just going to have to direct my focus towards that and skip all of the individual crap, all the individual stuff in there, just because of the fact that you're already made the decision that you want to move on. It's not, I want to get my host to fix themselves. It's, I want to move on. So since you've made that decision, just keep it simple and say, I want to focus on this new project. I think that's probably the easiest way to handle it.
That's a way to go forward in creating a new project that's outside of this podcast. But I think one of the main cruxes in his post here is he wants to move on with the same brand that he's built it. We've seen time and time again, different co-hosts claiming ownership of a podcast. Now, if the podcast isn't making any money, I guess it's no big deal and you just agreed to move on. But there are some sticky situations with podcast hosts over who controls the RSS feed, who controls the social media accounts, who controls the emails, that sort of thing. And for that, you really need a co-host agreement before you start. We've talked about it quite a bit. I'm not going to harp on it right here, but that is an added dimension here, that he wants to go forward with the same brand, the same RSS feed, the same account, but without the co-host as a 100% co-host. So I think that's a little bit of a trickier situation than just moving on to a different project.
And that's why I said a different project, because honestly, I think that it's a lost cause at this point here. If you're wanting to move on and you don't have that agreement, I think that you should say we should just shut it down. I think it's just all asking for it's a nightmare of a situation. It's asking for troubles if you didn't get that in writing right away. And if you can get him to agree to shut it down, then he's not going on with it. But unless you have that in writing, it's just going to make it even more difficult. That's my sort of take in it. Unless you have that familiarity that, it is your project. But I just think it's easier sometimes to move on and cut your losses. It sucks that you lose the brand, but it is what it is.
Another thing in the post was the fact that he didn't have the bandwidth for more than one show. He didn't want to continue the current show and then start a new project. I completely sympathize with that. The people that do multiple shows are really taking a huge chunk out of their lives to do that. I'm one of them. Steven is another, because he does 2 podcasts plus the network. So we understand that, and that is good that he's thinking in terms of that. And in of itself, I think that is a great how I saved my podcast, because he's not overextending. I assume it's a he. He's not overextending himself looking at multiple shows where he knows he just doesn't have the bandwidth to do that. So kudos for you. That probably individually saved your podcasting.
Absolutely. But if you have suggestions on how you've handled this before in your podcasting situation, or maybe just how you would have handled it, let's hope that that's the case. Maybe not, though. Maybe it was the former. Please let us know. Get in touch with us through any of the ways. You can find us at betterpodcasting.com. You can go ahead and tweet us at betterpod, or head on over to betterpodcasting.com and leave a comment there. But let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what I got going on right now, and that is podcasting in a hotel room.
In the past, we've talked about ways that you can keep your mobile gear simple. We've also talked about a bit about what we've learned doing public events like panels. But given how routinely both of us have traveled for work since we started Better Podcasting, it's surprising to us that we haven't talked about what we've learned during these events. So today, we're going to let you live vicariously through our pain and our experiences as we share the challenges and successes we've had keeping our podcast going as we've traveled. And the most important part of that is test it every time, but we'll get into that in a bit. So although we've touched on some of these in the past, theoretically, we've wanted to share what our mindset has been every time we travel. Stephen, why don't you start us off?
All right. So when I travel, I kind of look at things from two different points of view, depending on the familiarity that I have with the place that I'm planning on record. When I'm traveling new, I go with very low or no expectations. I expect to have crummy internet. I expect to have a noisy room. I expect to have not enough power outlets. And I expect that I'm going to have very little storage space for my stuff, as well as space to actually podcast with. But sometimes I can find things to be a little bit more predictable. For example, last year when I was routinely traveling for work, I often found myself at the same hotel room or the same hotel with a very similar hotel room to where I'd had the previous time. So when I had this situation, I knew roughly what the internet quality was going to be. I knew about what sort of space I would have. I knew the challenges that I would have and maybe some of the things that I might be able to do to solve said challenges. So with that, because I had the more familiarity, I felt a little bit more comfortable taking a little bit more chance and banking on podcasting a little bit more in those familiar spaces. How about you, SP?
When I travel, quite frankly, given my experiences, I have no expectations whatsoever, even if it's to a place that I've traveled recently to as well. But first, I will assume that I won't be able to connect, and we'll make contingency plans for that. So that includes either recording early, having a guest on the show instead of me, or maybe even skipping a week. So those contingencies are made in advance. Also, my mindset is when you test, because we'll talk about testing, when you test, it's not necessarily the same internet that's going to be available when you record. And that is a lesson learned. Also, I go into it with what can I do on my mobile devices? Are we talking audio only then? Maybe just one stream out. I have to bring the right connectors to connect my microphone to my mobile device. And we're talking about a slimmed down production value for that week. And perhaps since I do live shows, maybe no live, right? And I also go in with the mindset of what can I do on limited internet bandwidth? Or again, are we talking audio only? Are we talking limited live streams? Maybe not the multiple live streams that we're accustomed to, and maybe even descaled video quality. And then I finally go into the mindset of surprise, surprise, it all works. I still don't have a backdrop for my video like I do here, but I still ride the wave of successful podcasting on the road, and I just smile and move on to next week.
You don't smile for anything, SP. We know that that's a lie.
I just smiled right there. I laughed. You made me laugh. You make me smile, Stephen.
What the audio listener doesn't know is it was a fake laugh. He had a very stoic face the entire time. So one of the first tips that we have for you as a podcaster who's going to chance it, they're going to try to podcast from a hotel room, is get yourself a travel router and also look into wired internet if you can be so lucky. There's many benefits to having a travel router. This is something that from our personal experience, we both put in our bags when we are planning on going to a hotel room. It's because of these benefits. The reason why is because it allows a lot easier setup. You get this travel router to somehow connect to the internet that the hotel is offering you, and then it creates a little mobile network. And what's nice about that is that when you go and you set up, all of your devices are likely to remember that from the last time that you traveled. So you'll have your tablets, your PC, your phone, maybe a gaming device. All of those should, in theory, connect to your travel router automatically, and you don't have to go around to each one and enter that wireless from the hotel and put the password in on every single one. So it just makes the setup a little bit easier. You also, if you pick a router like we have, can possibly use the wired internet that I mentioned in the hotel. This is something that we have found to be especially useful when it has been available, because if you think about it, wireless internet, there's all sorts of congestion with wireless. If you've ever opened up your phone app and you've looked in your neighborhood, you probably see a whole bunch of Wi-Fi. Well, now you're in a hotel. Think about how many individual Wi-Fi access points that hotel probably has. There's a lot of congestion, and congestion means there's a higher chance of something dropping out and there being a problem. So if you can end up getting the wired internet into your hotel or into your travel router, that makes a more stable connection between your router and your hotel's internet connection. Yes, if you're connecting on your laptop over to your travel router, you're still going to have that possible wireless problem. But the thing is, you don't have a whole bunch of people pulling down one specific access point because you're just talking to your wireless router, which is talking to the hotel. Plus, a lot of these travel routers will give you the option of plugging in something to that router. It's usually just one jack available, but then you plug that in to your laptop or whatever device you really, really need to bank on. And then generally it's a lot more stable experience.
That's right. And also, let's talk about the fact that comfort is not king when you're suffering for your art. So what do many hotels have that many consumers don't? We're talking about individual air conditioners or individual heaters, those individual HVAC units that are in the room. And what happens with these? It blows. It literally blows air, and you have a noisy fan going on most of the time. Maybe a condenser from the air conditioner is genning up too. All that noise is going to bleed into your audio, and it's likely to bleed into your audio badly. So try to shut off the air conditioner or the heater or whatever is going on if you can. Sometimes you can't, but try to do that if you can. And one of the ways that you can fool it for shutting off if you can't is to try to set it to an extreme temperature leading up to the recording. Say it's in the middle of summer and it's running on air conditioning mode. So set that sucker down to 50 degrees for an hour or two before you start recording. Odds are it's going to take a while for it to actually raise up to the point where it's going to run again. So the temperature in the room, you're going to have that much time of fan-free, condenser-free noise in your recording. So that's a tip that you can use for your individual air conditioning to make it more tenable for your recording. And if it's in the winter, try to make it a sauna before you start recording. You might have to bring a short sleeve shirt when you start recording, but hey, it will work. Now, the temperature is not the only way you'll be uncomfortable. As Stephen alluded to, from a positioning perspective, podcasting in a hotel or somewhere on the road can be super hard to do. Every hotel that both of us have been in, whether it's a large table or just a small bedroom, organizationally, trying to position your travel microphone stand with your laptop and a notepad and perhaps even a webcam, it's literally a pain in the butt because there's just not a lot of space or tabletop space to do that. There is so much less room in a hotel room because they're designed to be slim. They're not designed to be lid in, and it is awkward to record. Plus, you're not dealing with your regular gear. You're dealing with things like travel microphones, travel mice for your laptops, travel laptops instead of your computer, and less potential screens. If you used to 3, 4, 6 screens, we've seen some elaborate setups, podcasting. If you're used to that, you're down to maybe 1 or 2 screens like your laptop, and maybe you use an HDMI cable to pipe into the hotel room TV for a second monitor, but it might not be positioned correctly. So you're down for your screens as well. It's just a holistically less comfortable experience.
One tip that we have from our personal experience is to, first thing that you get in, find that do not disturb sign and get that put up when you're recording. I have actually had many cards slid under the door while I've been podcasting, even doing this very podcast, that says that I missed the turn down service. And imagine what would have happened if I had not put that up before I podcast. I would have got one of those right at the door. So I am so glad that I put that up. And I think it's a really good thing for people to get in the habit of doing before you record. It's your on-air sign. Think of it as that. On air with your name here.
Do you actually have to put a sticky note underneath the do not disturb with your name here?
Obviously. Why would you not? I put a sticky note with my name on everything.
Just from a privacy standpoint, it's probably not a great idea, Stephen, to have your name out in the hallway like that of a hotel room.
Oh, so should I also not put my credit card number out there too? Whoops.
You might as well give it to me as long as you're giving it to everybody else. Creativity is a must when you're on the road. Even when you plan, creativity is going to be needed somewhere along the way. Some examples of ways that we have been creative while traveling include using a coffee maker as a camera tripod, or using an iRig adapter into an H1 if you're taking a really slimmed down recording apparatus. However, be prepared for it all to go wrong. For example, from my personal experience, I had a really poor connection just a few weeks ago when I was on the road. We didn't know if the video was going to work. So what we did is that Stephen asked for me to take a picture of myself so that he could use that as a static image. And this is not just done in podcasting. This is done with TV interviews, with newscasts or sportscasts all the time. Sometimes all you have is a phone call between the two. So they put up this picture of the individual or some sort of visual image which says who the person is or who they're talking about. Maybe it's a company logo, that sort of thing. So Stephen had me take a picture of myself in my hotel room, and we were going to use that in case my video dropped out. Fortunately, I don't think we needed to use that, but we had it in our hip pocket.
We've made it no secret here that when I am on the road, I do try to keep my production going. I try to do this by remote controlling my computer. However, I never take that as a given. I do end up, because of personal experience, planning on some fallbacks. I learned this early on in my road travels. Since then, what I have done is I have made sure that we've had a backup plan, like having people ready to play the bumps. So we still have a semi-produced live experience. For example, Stargate Pioneer plays many of the bumps on Better Podcasting when I'm on the road for the live version. And we also consider what other fallbacks we might need to have. For example, a few weeks ago, when we were doing Better Podcasting and were concerned about that connection, we actually talked ahead of time about how we would handle that situation if it went really, really bad. Right, SP?
We did. We talked about not doing the show at all. We talked about not doing it live. We talked about not doing video for that week. We talked about the contingencies. We made sure to have that conversation before I ever left so that I could have less pressure on me, but we would also have a plan of attack if things went bad. Proper prior planning leads to success. Also, for the GonnaGeek.com show, we're more than willing to skip a week, a little bit more so than Better Podcasting. So we all discuss and have an understanding that we may skip a week if all things go wrong. And matter of fact, just a couple of days ago, Chris and I were watching Steven struggle trying to get the GonnaGeek.com live stream going. And it wasn't me this time, it was Chris. He said, hey man, just calm down. We don't have to do this. We can skip a week. It's no big deal. And Steven had a little less pressure on him at that point in time. I actually physically heard his voice get less stressed, and he was able to work through the issues eventually, and we were able to do the live show. But I was right there in line with Chris. I wasn't going to compound the issue by telling Steven, no, don't worry, dude, you don't have to do it, making him feel like neither of us wanted to be on the podcast. I just let Chris handle it, and he handled it like a champ, and we were able to go. If Steven was not able to fix it, though, I would have been, hey, dude, it's no problem. I'm good with that skipping this week, too. And it would have been just fine.
He never wants to podcast with me. It's the truth. We all know it.
That's why I fire you all the time. I Better Podcast.
One tip that we have for you, if you are going to try to podcast on the road, especially regularly, is to package it and list it. So before you travel, you obviously need to consider, what do I need to travel with? And we've talked before about some ways to make those lists and ways that you can make it easier on yourself. So we're not going to dive into that again. But when you have decided what you want to travel with, and especially if you've had a successful run traveling with the equipment, we encourage you to create a list of this stuff. This comes again from personal experience, where all of a sudden we may have forgotten an item that we did not list. But if you do have the possibility of doing this, we encourage you to create yourself a go bag that you could just sort of keep there, ready for action. And then you just pull the bag and you're off to the races. You know that everything's there because you used it last time, and everything that you needed last time worked. So that's a really good thing, a tip that has worked for both of us. I know we've both kept that. And if you are going to pull an item from that go bag, make sure you gave yourself a big note that reminds you to put it back. Again, speaking from personal experience, I had to once go out and buy an SD card reader because of the fact that I forgot of a way to actually get the audio off of my Zoom H1. Yeah, even worse part about that was I was so used to traveling with a dedicated USB cord for the Zoom H1 that I completely forgot that the AT2005 used the exact same cord, and I had one of those right there. So it was, I caused myself to buy something extra and go through stress, all because I didn't list that darn original cord that I usually kept right with my H1.
That's so funny because the last time I traveled, I was using the Zoom H5 and I only had one set of batteries left, and I wanted to use that same USB cord to power my Zoom H5 that I was using for the Audio-Technica AT2005. So obviously the same cord couldn't be in both places, but now because I know that, I have a second cord in my go bag with the Zoom H5, so I can power the Zoom H5 through a USB connection and still have the AT2005 via USB. This is important stuff, and you make do with what you got because you have to. But if you can plan properly and have those individual cords or hardware objects that you need, it's all for the better. Here's another tip that we're going to give you. Pack only what you need, but with some consideration. For example, I don't bring a Zoom H6 and a Zoom H5 in case one breaks down. Just one or the other will do. And if things go wrong, they go wrong. Oh well. But you might want to bring an critical extra piece of equipment that is lightweight. For example, say that you need that micro USB cable and it's really important. You might as well bring two. A second isn't that much room in your bag. And I believe way back in the day, we had Jason Bryan tell us about his international traveling, and he always brings an extra cord because when you're traveling internationally, there's not always a Radio Shack there, or there's not a Radio Shack here either. Oh, to get that other cord. So
don't worry, there hasn't been a Radio Shack in Canada for about 10 years, so that's okay.
That's where Canada went wrong. So having those extra pieces of really critical equipment is a good thing.
So here's fun fact for you right now. is this week's the first time that I've actually traveled with the Zoom H6. Usually I use that crazy iRig into the H1 combination, but now that I got the Zoom L12 at home as the central hub of my podcasting, figured it was okay to travel with the H6. I didn't want to have to pull the H6 every time, risk my central hub at home while I'm traveling, as well as reset levels and everything. So now I'm traveling with the Zoom H6. What I've done, though, this time, because this was the first week I did it, is I actually brought with me my regular Zoom H1 system. And the reason why I did that was because I thought of what I needed for the H6 setup in theory, but you never know. And I didn't know what was going to be the easiest way to go out and get cables if I forgot something. So I just brought that fallback. So what I did was I planned for the worst case scenario for this time, took a little bit more luggage, but the next time I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep it simple. But I just thought this time it was worth dedicating a little extra space for that Zoom H1 fallback. Because you know what? I'm an idiot. Let's be honest.
And I completely concurred with that. I think that was the right thing to do for Steven, given the time he had to think things through and not test things. So I was like, yeah, dude, bring both. If it doesn't work, no big deal. It'll work next time. I also discovered on my last trip that my external USB hard drive that I bring with all my files on it, it has a couple of USB ports on it. So it acts as a USB hub. So all of a sudden I found myself running out of USB ports on my laptop, but bingo, I got 2 additional ones. That's awesome to have that. So if you can have a multiple use item that can help you lighten your load overall, like not bring a USB hub in my case, that's a good thing. And talking about lightening our load, we both continually, but individually, we have done this in the last couple of months. We've tried to work on lightening our bags. So even though for my instance, some of the travel that I do is driving versus flying, and it does offer the opportunity to bring more bags, still, that's gear that you have to carry. That's gear that you have to store. That's gear that you have to pack and handle for your trip. So even in that case, taking unnecessary stuff just weighs you down, takes additional precious time away from you having to haul it back and forth. And by the way, when you're traveling, time is at a premium. So you're either working or you're enjoying yourself on vacation or both, in addition to normal life schedules, like finding food because you don't have your kitchen with you, or working out, trying to find a gym to go work out. That's extra time when you're on the road. And if you can minimize the amount of time that it takes just to handle your gear, you're going to be ahead of the game.
Heavy sigh. One of the things that I can think off the top of my head that would help you lighten your travel load would be to not bring a big banner, SP.
That's just the cool factor, right? So I bring that and I throw it in the car, and I'm like, hey, if I don't have time to get it, I'm not going to use it. But if I have time, it's just a cool little accent, especially since I don't have my normal backdrop with me. So that actually, when I was writing that in the show notes, I was thinking, you know what? I do have that banner, that GonnaGeek.com banner that I take with me. And that is something that if I'm crunched for time, space, or whatever, I'm just not going to worry about it. And definitely if I'm going on an airplane, I am not taking that sucker with me. Talking about airplanes, Steven, what have you found with airplane travel lately?
Weigh the pros and cons of checked baggage versus carry-on baggage. A lot of times when people end up traveling with a checked bag, they also have a carry-on with them. And so I found that I tried to split my stuff based off of what I feel is most comfortable going in the checked bag. And I try to keep the important stuff, aka the Zoom H6, with me as a carry-on. My stuff like my cables, my other random stuff. Heck, even the Zoom H1, it was small enough that generally I would put that in the checked baggage. But think about, if you're going to do that, how you can maximize the safety of what's going into that checked bag. For example, let's say that you have yourself theoretically a little bit bigger feet and you have enough room in your shoe that your travel microphone will fit in there. Guess what? Yeah, take your shoe, you flip it over so that the sole is the part that's facing the outside of the bag. And then on the other side, you make sure that it is heavily padded with clothes, and you've basically made yourself a protective case for your microphone. Yep, totally done that. Absolutely checked my microphone before, and it was just making sure, okay, yes, it's in a Ziploc bag in my shoe. Let's make sure that that's very clear. I want to make sure that it is very well protected from the shoe odors.
If it was the ATR 2100, I don't think the odors would matter.
Fair enough. Yes, the ATR 2100 has its own scent. But so I've done that before so that if I want to make sure that I have a piece of gear that's a little bit more important, but I can't fit both on my carry-on, that way my microphone is still protected. And it actually works pretty good. Think about how tough the sole of your shoe is.
And if you back it up to another shoe right next to it, then you have even double the sole protection, and it's all great. I promise that we talk about actual testing once we do get to our destination. So we're going to talk about that right now. Do a test right away. And this is one of the first things that both of us do when we get there. Steven tries to test the wired connection and the Wi-Fi connection. And a lot of the hotels that I end up with, there is no wired connection. So I'm just testing the Wi-Fi. But we get a sense of what's available. Are we talking about 100 up and 100 down? Are we talking about 5 down and 0.5 up? It matters because then you can frame what sort of possibility you're going to do when you podcast. And if you're not getting any internet at all, it could be a blocked port, and you could work with the internet help desk for the hotel, probably not at the hotel itself, in order to get the port unblocked so you can actually get your internet. So now that you have an idea of what the internet speed is, you can make a plan of action for what you're going to have to do. If the internet is so poor, then you're just going to have to call it off, or maybe go to your Wi-Fi on your cell phone as well, or LTE or 4G or whatever you want to call it. Or maybe something got damaged in transit, right? So maybe your USB connection on your AT2005 gets crimped and you're not able to use that microphone. You might have to call things off, or you might go ahead and use your laptop mic or your webcam mic, or maybe have another microphone with you that you can use as well. Testing equipment once you get to a location is always a good idea. Finally, Steven, this is a great idea, because if you're not going to be editing your podcast until you get back to your house, you should probably upload your files to a online storage service before you pack up for your trip home.
Right, because as we all know, the risk only comes with traveling to your destination. There's no risk at all involved with the exact same flight in reverse. No, this is something that we want to remind people, that just because there's a risk of you not getting to the place safely with all of your stuff, there's a risk that your stuff's not going to get back home safely. So if you do have a couple of podcasts recorded to your SD card, and then on the way back, something happens and that no longer works, you have now basically broken your gear for nothing. You don't have a podcast out of it. You have broken gear, and you have a very, very, very sad heart. At least if you've uploaded that file before you return back, you know that you're at least getting a podcast out of that $500 loss. At least we have that as a consolation prize.
Yeah, I wish I would have had this with some certain drones that have fallen in lakes. So just saying, and I know that there's an ability to save some of that data to your phone or to your tablet that you're using. But in some cases, the cache gets all filled up and you just don't have it. So that's an example outside of podcasting, but similar to podcasting, that you want to save as much data as you can. Now we're going to get to the point where we ask you how you handle your travel podcasting. So we would love to hear how you handle your travel podcasting. You can get a hold of us on our Twitter account at BetterPod. You can go ahead and send us an email, podcast@betterpodcasting.com, or you can comment on our YouTube video at Gonna Geek, the YouTube channel, youtube.com/GonnaGeek. And go to Better Podcasting episode number 142, and you can leave a comment and we will read your comment on our next show. But we love the voicemails. We love the video. segments that we get from our listeners as well.
Welcome to this week's Better Podcasting Download.
Google Podcasts. I just don't even know. It's like Google Podcasts does something not so great. It gets backlash. Then they try to make some improvement and it gets backlash from Forbes. What? What is this about, SP? You found this article, sent it to me. I have some issues with it personally. I think there's a little jaded view going on in this article, but explain.
So I have 5 specific points that I want to bring up about this article. The article is titled, Google has a podcast app, but does it have a podcasting strategy? And this was published in Forbes.com by Bill Rosenblatt, who is a contributor to Forbes. The article starts off talking about Google launching Google Podcasts and talking about the Google Play Music, so on and so forth. A lot of the same stuff that we talked about before. And there's a lot of comparison to Apple. One of the early things that's stated in the article is, quote, as podcasting becomes a mainstream medium, Google is one of the only companies that's in a position to challenge Apple. The question is, will it, unquote. And I will add my statement to that quote of Google is one of the only companies that's in a position to challenge Apple today. Who knows in a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, what podcasting is going to look like. And if Google is going to be the only one that's going to be able to push against Apple, maybe Amazon is going to be a big player because of all of its personal devices. You never know what's going to happen in just a couple of years. The space can turn on a dime and be revolutionized. So yes, while today, Google is one of the few places that can challenge Apple, there are others that can get to that point relatively quickly. And that was my first issue with this article. And the second quote that I want to talk about is, quote, that's why you hear so many podcasters beg listeners to leave ratings on Apple Podcasts and iTunes. High ratings drive discovery, which increases audience, which leads to a higher ad revenue, as well as more discovery, a virtuous cycle, unquote. Stephen, what? We've been talking about for years how the ratings in Apple Podcasts and iTunes don't really matter at all about other listeners coming in and being able to find you. The discoverability issue. This person has absolutely no idea what is true in the podcasting space.
Yeah, that was actually one of my biggest points when I read this. That line there specifically set me off. And I'm like, okay, we've got a narrative and we're writing for it. That's one of my first flags with this. So I agree. Absolutely. Like, this is not valid.
The next quote that I want to bring up is, quote, as the owner of Android, Google is in a unique position to roll up the market around a single podcast platform, unquote. Yeah, it sure is. But they sure seem hesitant to do so because the Google Podcast, quote unquote, app is not an app. It's really just a sticker over their search feature, at least for now. And it's not ubiquitous. It's not forced on all of the Android platforms by Google natively. So therefore, it's not really a native app unless you want to call the search bar the native app. I have 2 more points to make on 2 different quotes. So the first quote is, quote, marketing a mainstream consumer media platform requires large investment and sustained effort over a period of time. Given its track record with paid music services such as ebooks, it's unclear whether Google is capable of this, unquote. Okay, there you go. That's the point that I just made. Was I'm not sure they're going to embrace this at all. They've certainly made strides forward. I'm not going to take that away from them. But is it enough to enhance the podcasting infrastructure on Android? I don't know at this point. None of us do know. We'll know better next year once the stats start rolling in from a year. But right now, I'm just not seeing the love from the listeners. All right, the last quote that I want to bring up is, quote, Google will be interested in investing in podcasts because the app's cross-device functionality gives it an advantage over Amazon in the smart smart speaker home assistant space. Otherwise, Google's only business motivation in promoting podcasting is that it can add listener data to its vast oceans of user data. We'll find out whether those are sufficient reasons for Google to make podcasting a priority in the coming years, unquote. Well, first of all, you don't know what Google is actually sucking up in terms of data. I just assume they're sucking up everything, but maybe they're not. And then second of all, who knows what they're actually going to suck up in terms of the podcasting. I will say this, though. The podcasting's train is already leaving the station, and we'll see if Google can run to catch the train. They actually have to run now to try to catch that train that's leaving the station. And I want them to, because it would expand the podcasting sphere to the normal individual a little bit more. But I just don't see an embracement of the space right now from Google, and I'm wanting more. So we'll see what comes in the next year. Steven, you have a lot of thoughts about this article.
The biggest thing that I've got with this article here is the message behind it, right? Do they have a strategy? And there's a lot of problems given based off of the fact that they haven't come forward with too much strategy-wise, and they've just released this app nonchalantly sort of thing. The thing that I think is important to remember is that the app was a critical part of the foundation to ever try to rival Apple. You have Apple, who basically made the standard for podcasting, right? Like iTunes did that. So they have built in this loyalty because podcasting has basically conformed to Apple. So then they went and Google made Google Play. Well, they didn't give people a reason to care about Google Play. Remember, Google Play Music Podcast had its own standard. Nobody really cared that much because the market was so small on Google Play Music. You cannot possibly rival Apple or give Apple a run for their money without a base. And how do you get that base? By leveraging the Android user base. And how do you do that? Well, you got to get people over to use your app. And how do they do that? Well, they make a native app, and that's what they've done. So like, it's to me, an obvious start point is to get the app out. Don't talk about the rest of the strategy points that we mentioned in here. Get the app out so that there are newcomers who pull up their Android phones and they see podcasts and they go, I know about podcasts. And they just go right into that app rather than searching for something else. So now you build that market, and now you have that potential to say, oh, okay, look, we actually have room to think of another strategy and really try to leverage this. Without the app, this is all irrelevant. So I totally just disagree with the narrative in this article altogether.
I think we poked a lot of holes in that article. It is interesting to note that this did run in Forbes, and Forbes has a certain heft to it. So we'll see what this ultimately means, but I just hope they get their acts together and start talking a little bit more legitimate data and facts the next time they publish something like this.
So let us know your thoughts at any of the ways we mentioned. All right, let's get to the Better Podback before we talk about that weird pro wrestling thing last week.
We got a lot of feedback, as we do every week, from our listeners. So thank you very much for both listening to Better Podcasting and giving us feedback. We love to read it and then talk about it in our next podcast, which is what we're doing here. We had a tweet from Adventures in Aurelia Pod, or it's just Adventures in Aurelia, and the account is at Aurelia Pod. At Better Pod, man, a lot of thoughts on the download for today, but ultimately I wish I hadn't missed that post. I feel like what the Redditor was wanting is more of an audio drama than an actual play podcast. And this is in response to our download last week, which was a Reddit post on a listener of D&D playthrough podcasts or tabletop gaming podcasts. And it was a lot of great tips for that. And I think at Aurelia Pod has a point here. It's talking about the listener wanting more of an audio drama than an actual play podcast. I think if you listen to a lot of entertainment content out there, it is more of an audio drama rather than a playthrough. So you might want to think about making it a little bit more like an audio drama, or maybe I am not seeing the purest of being a table gamer. So we'll see what the listeners want in the future.
We also got a tweet from at the covert _nerd. Got to get that right. They said, I loved your podcast success segment. Good to hear so many different ways podcasters measure success. And I got to say that we talked about that last week. We still continue to get tweets and messages about this. So again, to everybody who was involved, thank you very much. And let's just go ahead and encourage you to send yours in if you have it. We got lots of room here. We'll go ahead and we'll just stop everything that SP's saying to make room for your segment. So go ahead, send it in. We'll strip down SP's airtime. Reading the contract. We'll strip down my airtime so that you have time for your segment.
We'd love to hear what you think of success in podcasting. We also got a great email from Jose. He asked us, is it necessary to have a co-host, or can it just be me with a guest here and there? And I responded really quickly. Thanks for reaching out. You absolutely can start a podcast solo or with a co-host. You can have guest host or not have guest host. It's entirely up to you. And that is podcasting. There are no rules in podcasting. You don't have to do it one way or the other. There are better ways to do it, but hey, if you're looking at something that's revolutionary, you might want to try it and see what you get. If not, then you can stick to the good old norms. But in case of hosting, you can do it with 1, 2, 3, 6, 8. Really doesn't matter. It just matters if it's listenable and engaging content.
And Jose, I know that I didn't respond, as you may have guessed. I've been a little bit busy here and have had to pack to get away and all this stuff. But yeah, SP nailed it. And I want to say to people, we often here on Better Podcasting do talk about pairs or co-hosts and things like that. That's because SP and I have a lot of experience with co-hosts. So we're not going to sit there and talk about the solo podcast that we've done. Fun fact, SP and I have not done a 100% true solo podcast, either of us. So we're talking in theory and whatnot. So that's why we probably lean that way. But if you have advice for somebody like Jose, who does want to do a solo podcast, again, get in touch with us so we can pass that along.
We also had a great comment on our Reddit post that I responded to, and this came out of the blue. This was from Redditor Brock Cook. He said, I've been binge listening to Better Podcasting since I found it a week ago. I love it. So it's great meeting up with listeners in the wild on Reddit or Facebook or wherever we happen to be. So thank you very much, Brock Cook, for listening, and really enjoyed that interaction back and forth on Reddit. We also...
Fun fact, by the way, I'll just say this, that I've also been binge watching The Punisher, which is basically the same because this is a punishment for me each week.
I hope it is not a punishment for our listeners. We also had a quick hit on Discord from the host of the Cantina Cast, Mr. Jonesy himself. He is very into, and I know a lot of you are that listen to this podcast, he's very into the Plex podcasting. We talked about this a few episodes ago, how Plex opened up their doors to podcasts. Well, apparently the app actually got an update a couple of days ago, and he actually gave that to us. Neither of us had played with the Plex app or the Plex server very much, so we don't have personal experience, but Jonesy actually did, and he gave us a few quick early observations of this new Plex app on his phone. Number one was exporting and importing is a nice feature and worked for all but one of the shows he listened to. The second thing was it lacked a universal download/delete option, and it is cumbersome at best. The third observation he made is, I do not see a way to play all downloaded shows. If you have more than an episode of a podcast, they'll play in order, but it appears that you either have to queue manually or select a different show once those are done. And then queuing requires planning and remembering. And the last observation he made was, I would like to see grouping/lists for organization in Overcast. I have a favorites group that I use as my default. All shows are classified as to their subject matter, of course. For example, tech or podcasting or Star Wars or beer or sports, etc. He sees none of that functionality in Plex. So a little bit of this is user wishes and a little bit of this is functionality. And I'm looking forward to how this actually progresses in the future. And I know we have listeners that use Plex, so I am very interested. If you use Plex, please let us know how this is going with the new updated app.
Also, I'm very curious. Could you just tell me what category it shoves SP's Tech Podcasting Star Wars Beer Sports Cast? It's his newest podcast. Let us know which category it is. It's called SP's Tech Podcasting Star Wars Beer Sports Cast.
The multiple title detriment of podcasting. I don't know where to go, man. Where do I go?
And finally, before we wrap up, this just came out yesterday when we're recording this. We're recording this on Wednesday, August 1st. Logitech announced the acquisition of Blue microphones. Yeah, I'm not putting dramatic music in there. You can imagine that in your head. So Blue microphones are the people who make a variety of microphones. One of their most infamous podcasting microphones is, of course, as we all know, the Blue Encore 100, one of the most famous microphones that Blue makes.
Oh, wait a minute, Stephen. I think we have a newsreel about one of Blue's microphones.
Okay.
It's a Blue Yeti.
Oh, right. The Yeti. I forgot about that. Blue's second most famous microphone. So, yes, Blue obviously has a bit of a market for some podcasting microphones, even though here on Better Podcasting, we think your money could be better spent than on a Blue Yeti. The fact of the matter is there's a lot of podcasters who do buy this, whether it's just because they've seen it or it's because they actually genuinely enjoy it. There's a lot of people who have that. So Logitech has acquired Blue. And we wanted to just quickly mention that. You probably have heard about that. Our biggest thoughts at this point is sort of wait and see what happens. I think the biggest potential is Logitech's ability to possibly package things together right now. I don't know what Blue's financial state was. I don't know what Logitech's financial state is. I don't know any of that. But if you think about how Logitech has the webcam sort of consumer level camera market pretty captured, they have the C920 and the C922 that a lot of people use. And Blue has, believe it or not, a pretty good market with the Yeti. Think about that potential to package together. It will be interesting to see what Logitech does with this brand. Do they strip it down or do they continue it on? I'm very curious to see what happens. And I think at this point, it's just wait and see what happens.
Since Blue doesn't have any notable large diameter dynamic cardioid microphone like a broadcast microphone, I'm very curious as to how this will really affect the podcaster. I can see this for video teleconference calls where you add in even better condenser microphone into the fray, but I don't know with podcasting if that's going to work or not. So I have my reservations about this. I'm not as optimistic as Steven is. I just don't see the long-term benefit of these two companies coming together for podcasting. It might be great for other business entities, but for podcasting, I'm just scratching my head.
We'll find out. And finally, for those of you who don't watch our video show, well, first off, it's probably a good thing. You don't have to see our ugly mugs. So pat yourself on the back for that one there. But secondly, last week, you might have heard us give a little bit of a pro wrestling style intro. We knew when we did that the audio listener wouldn't know what was going on, but the video listener would. And this was because our good friend of the show, he's actually co-hosted a couple of episodes before, Jason Bryant, we decided to feature him on our show. If you want to check it out, head on over to betterpodcasting.com/141. It's only going to take you like 60 seconds. Just watch the first minute of the show and you will see that we had a little bit of fun. Jason just did a wrestling event and he got this like genuinely amazing photo of him. There's been so many people who have liked it and commented on it. It just screams pro wrestling. It's hilarious. I'm wonderful. It's like genuinely an amazing photo, and I think great for a profile. I think it's great for promotion. And so we decided to use that for the video side of things during our intro last week. So please, if you want to check that out and understand what that was, that's exactly where you can check that out at betterpodcasting.com/141. And Jason did see that, by the way, and he first only heard it on audio and then went and saw it on video and showed his wife. So Jason, thank you very much for not only coming on our show before, hopefully coming on again in the future, but being a good sport. We really, really appreciated it.
And thank you, Mrs. Bryant, for calling us nerds.
Absolutely. But there you go. That's going to wrap us up for another episode of Better Podcasting. So for episode number 142 of Better Podcasting, I'm Stephen John Drews saying if you podcast from a hotel room, you're crazy like me.
And I'm SP saying we'll see you next week. Bye.
See ya.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Better Podcasting. We want to hear from you. You can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. If you like the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review in iTunes. We encourage you to check out all of the other geeky podcasts available at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. This has been a Gonna Geek production. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next week.